The wind whipped across the steel-gray waters of the Norwegian Sea, carrying with it a salt-soaked chill that settled deep in the bones. Aboard the coast patrol vessel KV Andanes, Lieutenant Erik Nygaard scanned the horizon through binoculars, his gaze locking onto the outline of a cargo ship that hadn't appeared on any radar until 10 minutes ago. The crew, seasoned and alert, moved with a practiced quiet, knowing that anything unusual in these waters deserved scrutiny. The vessel in question flew a Norwegian flag. On paper, it was a fisheries support trawler registered to a company based in Tromsø. But something didn't sit right. The ship's movements over the past 72 hours had been erratic, lingering far too long near undersea communication cables and drifting dangerously close to areas where NATO naval exercises had taken place just days earlier. Even more concerning, its automatic identification system, AIS, signal, had been lost for nearly 6 hours the previous night, only to reappear miles off course, with no explanation in the ship's logged path. Erik lowered his binoculars and exchanged a glance with Commander Solveig Hansen, who stood beside him on the bridge. "That's the Fjord Mare," he said quietly. "It was supposed to be refueling in Bergen today." "Looks like it changed its mind," Solveig replied, her voice steady but wary. "Let's find out why." As the KV Andanes closed the distance, Erik felt the same low buzz of tension he'd grown familiar with over his years of naval service. Encounters like this didn't often escalate, but they also never turned up empty. This region had become a geopolitical chessboard, with small fishing boats masking surveillance gear and commercial ships showing up near sensitive installations. The Baltic, the Barents, and now even the North Sea. It was a theater of shadows. The Fjord Mare responded to the hail in broken Norwegian. The voice on the radio was male, thickly accented, and vague about the ship's mission. Something about fisheries research. When asked for crew identification, there was static, then an abrupt reply that documents would be provided in port. That raised more than one eyebrow. Norwegian maritime regulations required real-time electronic copies to be available upon request at sea. Dodging the request was not illegal, but it wasn't normal either. Erik made a decision. "Let's circle them. Get visuals. Full zoom." The ship's deck was cluttered with crates and tarps, nothing too suspicious at first glance. But tucked between the shipping containers, he spotted a pair of large, oddly shaped cylindrical structures, partially concealed but just visible enough to draw attention. They didn't look like trawling equipment. They looked like the kind of modular enclosures used for long-range surveillance antennas or submersible drones. "They're trying to blend in," Erik muttered. "But they're not trying very hard." Solveig nodded, confirming his instincts. "Run a quiet query on that Tromsø company. Let's see who really owns the Fjord Mare." Within 30 minutes, the vessel's web of ownership began to unravel. The parent company in Tromsø was registered to a shell firm based in Cyprus. That firm, in turn, had been linked through financial audits to another holding entity in St. Petersburg. The trail didn't conclusively scream espionage, but it whispered it loud enough for anyone paying attention. A cold realization settled in. The Fjord Mare was almost certainly Russian. Whether intelligence gathering, infrastructure mapping, or testing NATO response times, its purpose was cloaked in legality, but its intentions were anything but neutral. The sea swelled beneath them as weather rolled in, gray skies pressing low and waves beginning to churn. But Erik's focus didn't waver. "If this is what we think it is, we're not just dealing with a single ship," he said. "We're looking at a pattern." Solveig glanced toward the horizon, where another vessel had just crept onto the radar. Different name, different flag. Danish this time, but on a nearly identical path to where the Fjord Mare had disappeared the night before. "What are the odds?" she said flatly. "Too perfect to be coincidence," Erik replied. He could already feel the edges of something larger taking shape. Russian maritime strategy had grown more sophisticated, less about brute force, more about ambiguity. Civilian-looking vessels operating in gray zones, threading the needle of international law, staying just close enough to provoke concern, but far enough to avoid confrontation. As the KV Andines logged its surveillance data and prepared a full report for NATO Maritime Command, Eric knew the real battle was only beginning, not one of gunfire or missiles, but one of narratives, tactics, and plausible deniability. The fjord mare eventually turned away, moving slowly and innocently toward the Norwegian coast, promising documents it would likely never produce. But the message had been sent and received. And while the flag atop its mast still fluttered red, white, and blue, Eric understood now. It wasn't the flag that told the truth. It was the silence underneath it. Nightfall over the Norwegian sea was unforgiving. The stars barely pierced the thick cloud cover, and the only light that guided the KV Andines now came from the low, red interior glow of the bridge and the faint phosphorescence of waves breaking against the hull. Lieutenant Eric Newgard stood silently by the console, his eyes fixed on the radar screen. The second suspicious vessel, Nordkaptein, had entered their surveillance zone just 30 minutes earlier. Registered in Aarhus, Denmark, the ship was supposedly en route to Reykjavik with a cargo of industrial equipment, but its pattern mirrored the fjord mare almost precisely, too precise. Eric's jaw tightened as he reviewed the data. The AIS logs, though seemingly intact, were time-stamped in inconsistent intervals. Tiny anomalies, but enough to suggest spoofing. He tapped a button to replay the vessel's last known path overlaid against sensitive infrastructure grids. The pattern drew a sharp line right over a Norwegian undersea fiber optic relay point, one that connected key NATO communication lines between Iceland and mainland Europe. He turned toward Commander Solveig Hansen, who had just finished briefing Oslo's Maritime Intelligence Unit. Her face was grave. The Danes deny any connection. They claim the paperwork checks out, but they're concerned too. That flag is a disguise. We're being outmaneuvered. Eric leaned forward. 2 ships, 2 flags, same tactics. This isn't just opportunistic, it's coordinated. Solveig nodded slowly, her voice quiet. Which means the fjord mare was a decoy. This one might be the real operation. They made the decision to intercept. Not aggressively, but assertively. Standard procedure dressed in diplomacy. No boarding unless absolutely necessary, but they would shadow the vessel through the night, monitoring all frequencies, collecting every piece of evidence they could. The crew moved swiftly, silently, each man and woman aboard the KV Andines aware that games like these, cat and mouse in contested waters, were what defined modern naval strategy. The days of open sea battles had faded. Now, stealth and subtlety ruled. A soft ping alerted Eric to an incoming transmission. A weak signal, likely bounced through multiple relays, requested permission to speak directly with the Norwegian Navy liaison. The message was curious, terse. Assistance needed. Onboard issue. Immediate contact. Solveig raised an eyebrow. They're reaching out now? That's a new move. Eric frowned. Could be bait. But it could also mean they're cornered, she replied. They decided to respond. Carefully. A coded reply was sent, offering a controlled channel for voice transmission. The reply that came through moments later was unexpected. The voice wasn't Russian, nor was it Danish. It was unmistakably Ukrainian. The speaker identified himself as Andriy Lysenko, a ship's engineer who claimed to have defected. His words came in hurried fragments, as if time were limited. I have information. This ship, Nordkaptein, is not what it seems. Russian control. Crew half mercenaries. The equipment, it's not for cargo. It's for signal mapping. NATO, fiber lines, sonar. I was promised work. They lied. Eric looked at Solveig. He's blowing the whole thing open. Solveig gave the order to begin data encryption and recording of the conversation. Andriy continued, detailing compartment layouts, hidden antenna structures beneath removable floor panels, even naming a Russian intelligence handler allegedly embedded on board under a false Danish alias. "It's a mobile surveillance ship. This isn't the first one. There are more. Spread out through North Sea, Baltic, Black Sea," he warned. The room fell silent for a long beat after the transmission ended. Eric could feel the implications settling like weight on his shoulders. This was no longer a naval curiosity. It was a pattern of covert military espionage operations designed to exploit civilian maritime networks. And Norway, due to its geographic position and NATO ties, had become a key observation point. Their immediate mission changed. They were now protecting a whistleblower. With intelligence, this valuable extraction became a top priority. But there were obstacles. First and foremost, the Nordkaptein itself. If Lysenko was correct, the ship would have at least 2 armed personnel loyal to Russian handlers. Perhaps more. If they suspected their cover had been blown, their response could be immediate and violent. The next hours were tense. The KV Andanes coordinated quietly with a Danish frigate patrolling 100 kilometers south. They arranged a rendezvous point. 2 helicopters would approach under minimal radar visibility, one to secure extraction, the other as a diversion. Eric returned to the deck, where the sea had calmed, but the tension had not. The first lights of dawn began to brush the sky in faded gray. In the distance, the silhouette of the Nordkaptein still drifted steadily, unaware, or perhaps fully aware, of the noose tightening around it. He thought about Lysenko, trapped between worlds, risking everything for truth. And he thought about the game they were playing, one where flags were masks, identities were layered in lies, and the real weapons weren't guns or torpedoes but cables, signals, and silence. "Once we get him out," Solveig said, appearing beside him, "we'll have the leverage, but we'll also have a target on our back." Eric nodded slowly. "We already do." The wind howled across the flight deck of the Danish frigate HDMS Ivar Huitfeldt as the helicopter touched down, blades slicing through the Arctic air like a warning. 2 armed personnel sprinted across the wet steel, assisting a trembling figure in a jumpsuit and oil-stained boots, Andriy Lysenko. His eyes darted nervously, his steps unsure, but he carried something clutched to his chest. A hard drive, wrapped hastily in duct tape and thermal foil. It was more than evidence. It was a key. Commander Solveig Hansen watched from the operations center aboard the KV Andines, her fingers steepled under her chin. The extraction had succeeded, but it was only the beginning. The hard drive contained a partial digital map, surveillance blueprints, encrypted frequency logs, and patterns of Russian civilian-flagged vessels that had been tailing NATO ships under the guise of commercial shipping. It was a breadcrumb trail, but not the whole loaf. Eric Nygaard entered the room quietly, carrying a decoded transcript from Andri's debrief. "They've used at least 6 vessels across 3 seas, each posing as flagged under different nations. Flags of convenience, but the movements all point to Murmansk." Solveig's eyes narrowed. "That means naval intelligence, not just rogue actors." Eric nodded. "Andri claims that the crews are rotated every 6 weeks. There's a whole pipeline in place. The vessels swap names, ports, and even hull markings." There was no more speculation. What they were dealing with wasn't an isolated operation. It was a state-level maritime intelligence program designed for digital infiltration and naval disruption. The cover was brilliant in its simplicity, used legitimate-looking merchant vessels to float under NATO noses while collecting high-value data from critical communication lines and naval exercises. The timing couldn't be worse. NATO had scheduled joint exercises in a matter of days, right in these waters. The Norwegian Sea would be teeming with aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, all radiating data and ripe for interception. "We have to assume they'll escalate," Solveig said. "They won't let Lysenko's defection go unanswered." Her prediction came true within 48 hours. A third ship, this time flagged under Liberia, was spotted hovering near NATO maneuvers south of Svalbard. It mimicked fishing patterns, but stayed in unusually close formation near a British destroyer. When hailed, it responded in broken, delayed English. Attempts to approach were met with veiled threats of legal retaliation for harassment. That was the new battlefield: law, language, and latency. Back aboard the KV Andines, André worked alongside Norwegian analysts, unraveling the layers of encryption stored in his drive. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the patterns became. There were not only maps of fiber cable grids, but intercepted naval schedules, signal signatures of individual destroyers, even probable U.S. aircraft carrier deployment routes. "It's like they've been eavesdropping on a global scale," André murmured. "And we helped them build the tools to do it." His face was pale with guilt. He had once believed he was building signal-boosting modules for legitimate maritime systems. But they had been reconfigured, tuned to frequencies specific to NATO communications. We were blind, or maybe we didn't want to see. As the pieces came together, Oslo made a choice that would ripple through the alliance. They would expose the program. A special session of NATO Maritime Command was called. Names, ship registries, and intercepted data would be shared. It was a gamble, shining light on a covert war that most of the world didn't even know existed. But Norway understood something now. Silence was part of the weapon. Solveig and Eric were both present for the transmission. In a stark briefing room lit by fluorescent panels, Solveig spoke directly into the camera, beaming her words to Brussels and Washington. "We've confirmed the existence of a disguised naval surveillance effort conducted via civilian shipping lanes. It threatens the integrity of maritime borders, of alliances, and of truth itself. If we do nothing, we're not only blind, we're complicit." Her voice rang clear, firm, and without drama. And just like that, the war moved into the open. Diplomatic pressure followed. Flags of convenience came under scrutiny. Port access to questionable vessels was revoked across several EU nations. But the response from Moscow was cold and precise: denial, followed by counter-accusations. "This is Western provocation," their spokesperson declared. Still, the truth was out. Back on the Norwegian coast, as the KV Andines returned to harbor, Eric stood at the rail watching the shoreline draw nearer. The skies were finally clear, and seagulls cut lazy spirals in the sunlight. The sea had grown calm, but he knew better than to trust that calmness. This wasn't the end. It was only the next chapter in a new kind of naval war. One where ships wore masks, maps were weapons, and courage meant more than firepower.